A millionaire drives along a deserted highway at sunset when he finds a 6-year-old girl alone, crying by the roadside, begging for help. When he asks where her parents are, she whispers, "Sir, my daddy left me here." Outraged, he takes her to her home. But when he knocks on the door, the girl's father stares coldly at him and says just 2 words that make the millionaire completely lose control. The fine, persistent rain beat against the windshield of the luxury sedan, a monotonous sound that matched the grey landscape stretching for miles. Arthur Sterling drove without a destination, the vehicle's powerful engine humming softly beneath the hood, a stark contrast to the restless silence that filled his soul. On that gloomy Thursday afternoon, the weight of his loneliness felt denser than the dark clouds overhead. The success, the deals, the fortune he had amassed over the years, none of it could fill the void a childhood echo had left in his chest. He was a man who had everything but felt he possessed nothing essential. The image of a cold, impersonal iron gate swinging shut behind him when he was just a boy haunted his thoughts at the most unexpected moments. Like this one, the feeling of being left behind was a wound that had never fully healed. That's when he saw it. On the shoulder of the deserted highway, a splash of color stood out against the pale, rain-soaked green of the vegetation. At first, his brain registered it as a discarded bag of trash or a stray animal, but as he drew closer, the shape defined itself, and his heart gave a painful lurch in his chest, stopping for a fraction of a second. It was a child, a little girl, small and frail, in a yellow raincoat that seemed far too big for her tiny frame. She was standing perfectly still, her arms outstretched toward the road, as if pleading with the cars speeding past. Arthur's stomach churned. The scene was so unreal, so absurdly desolate, that he instinctively slammed on the brakes, the sound of the tires hissing on the wet asphalt. The car skidded to a stop a few dozen yards ahead. Through the rearview mirror, he saw her, now with her face turned in his direction, an expression of panic and hope intermingled. Without a second thought, he shifted into reverse and maneuvered the car until he was alongside her. He cut the engine, and the silence was filled only by the sound of the cutting wind and a low, almost inaudible whimper he could now distinguish. He opened the door and stepped out, feeling the cold drizzle on his face. He approached slowly, his hands visible so as not to frighten her. The girl didn't move. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her large brown eyes red from crying. Fixed on him, her dark hair was plastered to her forehead by the dampness. She couldn't have been more than 6. A lump formed in Arthur's throat, a mixture of rage and overwhelming compassion. Who, in their right mind, would leave a creature so small and helpless in a place like this? He knelt to her level, maintaining a safe distance. His voice came out hoarser than he intended. "Hey there, little one. Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The girl sniffled, her small shoulders trembling from cold and fear. She looked down at her own hands, which were clasped together in a pleading gesture, as if she were praying. Then she raised her eyes to him again, and in a trembling voice, a whisper nearly lost in the wind, she answered the question that was thundering in Arthur's mind. "Mister, my daddy left me here." Those words, simple and direct, hit Arthur with the force of a punch. The old wound in his chest tore open, bleeding a familiar, unbearable pain. The injustice of it, the cruel and deliberate abandonment, ignited a flame of protective fury within him. In that instant, he knew he couldn't just call the police and be on his way. He couldn't turn her over to a system he himself knew for its coldness and impersonality. He looked into that child's eyes and saw himself, decades ago. A silent promise formed in his mind, an unshakable commitment. He would fix this. He would take her home, find the person responsible for this atrocity, and make him understand what he had done. Little did he know that this decision, born of the purest compassion, was the first step on a path of no return, one that would lead him to a place far darker than he could ever imagine. Arthur wrapped her in a cashmere blanket he kept on the back seat, the softness of the fabric a stark contrast to the harshness of the situation. The girl, who he learned was named Leah, curled up on the passenger seat, a small bundle of fear and relief. The warmth from the car's heater finally seemed to reach her bones, and the shivering in her body subsided, replaced by quiet sobs that broke Arthur's heart with every shaky breath. He drove slowly, trying to coax the way back to her home from her as gently as possible. The directions were vague, fragmented by a frightened child's memory after the big bridge, near the store with the red roof. Each of her words was a small thread of hope he clung to, weaving a makeshift map in his mind. He felt like he was navigating uncharted waters, guided by a broken compass, but his determination was a lighthouse. That man, her father, was going to hear what he had to say. Rage simmered beneath his skin, but he kept it in check, forcing a calm and reassuring tone so as not to frighten the little creature beside him even more. As they followed her directions, the scenery around the luxury car changed drastically. Wide, tree-lined avenues gave way to narrow, potholed streets. Mansions with manicured lawns were replaced by small houses with peeling paint and graffitied walls. Arthur felt the curious stares of the few residents who braved the drizzle, their faces turning to follow the unusual gleam of his car in this neighborhood forgotten by time and progress. A sense of discomfort settled in him, not from fear, but from an inexplicable shame, as if his wealth were an insult to this girl's reality. Finally, Leah pointed with a hesitant finger. "It's there, the house with the rusty iron gate." Arthur's heart went cold. The house was the very picture of neglect. The tall, unkempt grass invaded the sidewalk. The gate hung from a single hinge, and one of the front windows was patched with a piece of cardboard. It was a place that screamed abandonment. He parked, took a deep breath, and turned to Leah. "Stay here, okay? I'll be right back." She just nodded, her large, apprehensive eyes fixed on him. Arthur got out of the car and walked up the cracked cement path to the front door. The wood was warped and stained by moisture. He knocked with his knuckles, the sound echoing hollowly. It took a full minute, but finally the door creaked open. A man appeared, his shirt rumpled and stained, his hair greasy and unkempt. A strong, sour smell of stale alcohol emanated from him, tainting the air around. His eyes were glazed over and took a moment to focus on Arthur. "What do you want?" he slurred, his voice thick. Arthur remained calm, his fury a tight knot in his stomach. "I found your daughter on the side of the highway, alone, in the rain." He expected a reaction: shock, relief, shame, anything. But the man just blinked slowly, as if processing uninteresting information. He glanced over Arthur's shoulder, saw the expensive car and Leah's silhouette in the passenger seat. A strange glint passed through his eyes, something that wasn't concern, but a cold, distant calculation. He shrugged, a gesture of indifference so brutal it shocked Arthur to his core. "Oh, her," he said, with a disdain that was almost surreal. Then he looked directly at Arthur, a crooked smile forming on his lips. "You like her so much. You can have her." The sentence hung in the air, venomous and absurd. Before Arthur could react, formulate a response, scream his outrage, the door slammed shut with a final, violent thud that echoed down the quiet street. He stood there, frozen on the dilapidated porch, the echo of those words reverberating in his mind. Left outside, with a terrified child waiting for him in the car, and the crushing certainty that the monster wasn't on the highway, but inside that house. Arthur remained motionless on the porch, his hand still in the air where the door had been seconds before. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place on the other side was like the final sentence from a cruel court. "You can have her." The phrase echoed in his head, a slow poison spreading through his veins. It wasn't just the rejection of a child. It was the nullification of her existence, the transformation of a human being into an unwanted object, something to be discarded. His own history, the memories of the group home, the anonymous faces that had passed him by without ever truly choosing him, it all came flooding back with overwhelming force. The fury he'd felt before gave way to a deep, familiar ache, an empathy so intense it was almost physical. He was no longer looking at the situation from the outside. He was in it, reliving his own abandonment through this little girl's eyes. He had to do something, but what? Knocking again would be pointless. The man inside was lost in his own misery, unable to see beyond the alcoholic haze. He turned and walked back to the car, each step heavy with uncertainty. Leah watched him through the window, her small, pale face a stark contrast to the dark interior. Her eyes weren't asking, "Are we going home?" but rather, "What's going to happen to me now?" There was no hope in them, only the resignation of someone who had grown used to the worst. When he opened the door, she flinched instinctively, as if expecting to be scolded. The sight broke another piece of Arthur's heart. He got in and shut the door, plunging the car into a tense silence. He looked at her, at the expensive blanket enveloping her, a symbol of a world of comfort she had never known. No, he couldn't just drive away. He couldn't hand her over to a faceless shelter, to a system that could be just as negligent as that father. He needed proof, something to show anyone the reality of that house. He needed to see what she saw every day. "Leah, I'm going back in there, just for a minute," he said, his voice firm, hiding the storm of emotions raging inside him. "Lock the doors and don't open them for anyone." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't question him. Arthur got out again and, this time, instead of knocking, he tried the knob. To his surprise, the door gave way. In his haste and anger, the man hadn't locked it properly. Arthur hesitated for a second, then stepped inside. The smell hit him first, a sour mix of old liquor, mold, and accumulated garbage. The dim light of the living room revealed the full extent of the horror. Empty beer bottles and liquor bottles covered nearly every flat surface. Dirty dishes with crusted-on food were stacked on the coffee table. The floor was sticky, and a pile of dirty laundry formed a small mountain in one corner. There wasn't a single toy, a single colorful drawing on the wall, nothing to indicate a child lived there. On the threadbare sofa, the man was snoring loudly, his mouth agape. Oblivious to everything, Arthur felt a wave of disgust, but also pity. This was the picture of self-destruction. He looked around, searching for any trace of Leah's life. He found a small room in the back with a thin mattress on the floor and a graying sheet. Beside it lay a single teddy bear, one eye missing and its seams coming apart. This was the entirety of her world. That bear was her only companion in this hell. His heart heavy with evidence, he left the house, closing the door silently behind him. He returned to the car, the smell of the house clinging to his clothes. He looked at Leah, who was waiting for him with the patience of someone who had been waiting her whole life. "It's okay, Leah," he whispered. "We're going to figure this out. I'm going to call some people who can help, people who will make sure you're safe." He picked up his phone, ready to call the police, child services, whoever it took. But as he looked at the device in his hand, Leah's face transformed. Fear gave way to absolute panic. She lunged forward, her small hands grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "No!" she screamed, her voice torn with terror. "Mister, please, don't call them. Don't call the police. Please!" Leah's shriek echoed inside the car's confined space, sharp and desperate. Arthur froze, the phone still in his hand, his thumb hovering over the emergency number. The panic in the girl's eyes was visceral, a reaction far more intense than he would have expected from a child in her situation. It wasn't just fear of strangers or the anxiety of being taken away. It was a deep, almost primal terror that seemed to stem from an experience seared into her soul. The tears she had so bravely held back now streamed freely, carving new paths through the grime on her face. She was trembling uncontrollably, not from cold, but from sheer dread. Please, mister, don't call," she sobbed, clinging to his arm as if her life depended on it. "They'll take me away again, and it'll be worse." The word "again" hit Arthur like a blaring alarm. This wasn't a hypothetical fear of the unknown. It was the memory of something real, a trauma that had already happened. He slowly lowered the phone, placing it on the console between the seats in a gesture to reassure her. "Okay, Leah, I won't call. It's all right. Take a deep breath," he said, his voice soft, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. His initial plan, so clear and just in his mind, had crumbled in seconds. Calling the authorities was the standard procedure, the right thing to do. But what if, for her, the right thing was the most terrifying thing in the world? He was in completely new territory, where the rules of his orderly, logical life didn't apply. Her vulnerability had completely disarmed him, forcing him to rethink every step. He spent the next few minutes just waiting for her to calm down. He offered her a bottle of water from the glove compartment, and she took small sips, her sobs gradually subsiding. The trust she was placing in him, a complete stranger, was both moving and terrifying. He was her only link to safety at that moment. He couldn't break that trust. "Leah, can you tell me why you're so scared of them?" he asked gently. After her breathing had evened out, she looked down at her lap, at her small hands twisting a corner of the blanket. "The last time a lady came, she said she was taking me to a nice place, with lots of toys." Her voice was a whisper, but it was a loud place. "And the other kids, they took my stuff, and the lady there yelled a lot. I cried every day. Daddy had to come get me. He was really mad at me for making him go there." The story, told with the brutal simplicity of a child, painted a devastating picture. The system that was supposed to protect her had traumatized her further, and her return home wasn't a salvation, but the cause of her father's fury. Arthur understood. To Leah, official help meant being ripped from the little she knew, even if it was a hell, only to be thrown into another one, a hell of impersonality and institutional neglect. And in the end, she wound up back where she started, carrying the added guilt of having bothered her father. It was a vicious cycle of neglect and trauma. Arthur's decision solidified. He wouldn't turn her in, not until he had a plan, a way to ensure she wouldn't fall through the cracks of a broken system again. He started the car. "All right, Leah, we won't call anyone for now. You're going to stay with me. We'll go to my house, where it's warm and safe. You can have a bath, eat something, and sleep in a real bed." "How does that sound?" he proposed, trying to sound casual, as if taking a lost little girl home was the most natural thing in the world. A flicker of uncertainty and hope sparked in her eyes. "For real?" she asked, her voice small. "For real," he confirmed, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, as his mind was already miles away, calculating the risks. He was crossing a line. He was getting involved in a way that went far beyond a simple act of compassion. He was, in the eyes of the law, harboring a minor without authorization. He was putting himself in a legally precarious position. But as he looked at the tear-streaked face beside him, he knew he had no other choice. He accelerated, leaving the grim neighborhood behind, driving toward the comfort of his mansion, but with the uneasy feeling that he was actually driving into the eye of a hurricane. The arrival at Arthur's mansion was like stepping into another universe. Leah, her eyes wide, stared at everything from the car window, her mouth slightly agape in awe. The tall, imposing, wrought-iron gates swung open silently, revealing a driveway lined with perfectly manicured trees and gardens that looked like they were straight out of a magazine. The house, a modern structure of glass and concrete, glowed with warm, welcoming lights against the darkening evening sky. It was a world of order, beauty, And silence, the exact opposite of the chaos and decay she knew. When Arthur led her inside, her jaw dropped. The high ceilings, the polished marble floors that reflected the lights like a pool of water, the floating staircase that led to the second floor. It was bigger than any place she had ever seen. "Wow," was the only word she managed to whisper. Her reaction, so pure and genuine, brought a rare smile to Arthur's face. For the first time that day, he felt he might have done the right thing. He led her directly to one of the guest rooms, a spacious chamber with a huge, soft bed covered in a fluffy white duvet. "This will be your room for now," he said. As she looked around, timidly touching the bedspread, Arthur went to his own closet and returned with a soft cotton t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants, which would fit her like a giant, comfortable set of pajamas. He showed her the ensuite bathroom, with a tub that looked more like a small swimming pool. "You can take a warm bath. There's soap and clean towels here. I'll go make us something to eat, okay?" Leah just nodded, still stunned by the grandeur of it all. Seeing her there, so small and out of place amidst so much luxury, reinforced Arthur's resolve. He would protect her from the cruel world that had discarded her. As he prepared a simple macaroni and cheese in the stainless steel kitchen, his thoughts were racing. He needed help, someone he could trust. He picked up his phone and called the one person who could understand the complexity of the situation without judging him, his lawyer and longtime friend, Helena. "Arthur, is something wrong?" Her voice came through the line, calm and professional, even at this hour. He took a deep breath. "Helena, I need you. I've done something complicated." And then he told her everything. The girl on the highway, the visit to the house, the father's reaction, Leah's panic at the mention of the police. He omitted nothing, not even the fact that he was technically committing a crime by keeping the child with him. On the other end, Helena's silence was heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice was a mix of concern and exasperation. "Arthur, do you have any idea what you've done? You've taken a minor from the custody of her father, even if he is a monster. Legally, that's kidnapping. You could lose everything." "I know, Helena, but you should have seen the place. You should have seen her eyes. I couldn't leave her there," he replied, his voice thick with unshakable conviction. "The system failed her before. I'm not going to risk it failing her again." There was another pause. He could almost hear her thinking, weighing the options. Okay, Arthur. Don't do anything else. Don't call anyone. Don't take her anywhere. Keep her there. I'll be at your house tomorrow morning and we'll come up with a plan. But understand this, you've walked into a swamp. And her father, as awful as he is, still has the law on his side. He can use this against you in ways you can't even imagine." After hanging up, Arthur served the mac and cheese. Leah, now clean with damp hair and wearing his oversized clothes, looked even smaller. She ate in silence, with a ravenous appetite that spoke of a long-held hunger. After dinner, he took her to her room. She climbed into the bed and snuggled under the duvet, looking like a tiny princess in a castle. "Thank you, mister," she whispered, her eyes already heavy with sleep. "You're welcome, little one," he replied, tucking her in. He turned off the light, leaving only a small lamp on. As he closed the door, a sense of peace washed over him, but it was fleeting. Helena's words echoed in his mind. "He can use this against you." At that moment, he didn't care, but a seed of unease had been planted. He had no idea that just a few miles away, in a dark and filthy house, the seed of calculated interest was already beginning to sprout in the mind of a man who had just realized his discarded daughter might, after all, have some value. The next morning brought an uncomfortable clarity. The sunlight streaming through the vast living room windows seemed to expose the fragility of Arthur's situation. Leah was sleeping soundly in the guest room, a peaceful sleep she likely hadn't had in a very long time. Seeing her like that, safe and at peace, reinforced his conviction. But the world outside wasn't a sanctuary, it was a legal battlefield, and he had walked onto it unarmed. Punctually at 9 o'clock, Helena arrived. She was an impeccably dressed woman, with a sharp gaze that seemed to see through any pretense. She carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression that was a perfect blend of maternal concern and professional rigor. She waved off the coffee Arthur offered and got straight to the point. "Let's review the facts, Arthur, no emotion, just the facts," she said. "Sitting on the designer Italian sofa, you found a child. The father rejected her. You brought her home. You did not notify the authorities." "Correct." Arthur nodded, feeling like a defendant in court. "First step. We need to understand the father's legal situation. Full name, address. I'll run a search through every system, criminal record, prior reports to Child Protective Services, anything," she continued, already jotting notes on a legal pad. "Second, we need a formal statement. Yours, and if possible, hers. But that's tricky. A child can't testify without a counselor or legal guardian present, which right now is still her father. It's a catch-22. As they spoke, Arthur's phone rang, an unknown number. He hesitated, looking at Helena. She motioned for him to answer, putting it on speaker. The voice on the other end was slurred and hostile, the same as the day before. "Hey, you, the rich guy. Where's my daughter?" The voice of Leah's father, Rick, was laced with an aggression that hadn't been there the night before. "She's safe, with me," Arthur replied, his jaw tight. A derisive laugh came from the other end. "Safe? You stole her. That's kidnapping. I was drunk. I didn't know what I was doing. I want my daughter back, or else I'm going to the cops and telling them some millionaire just showed up and took my little princess." The word princess, uttered with such cynicism, made Arthur's blood boil. Helena placed a hand on his arm, a signal for him to stay calm. "What do you want, Rick?" Arthur asked, his voice cold as ice. "I want what's rightfully mine. You've caused my family trauma. This separation, it's painful. I think a little compensation for the emotional distress would be fair, you know, to help us get back on our feet. 10,000, and I forget this ever happened." The demand was so blatant, so vile that Arthur was speechless. Helena, however, remained impassive. She took the phone from his hand. "Mr. Dawson, my name is Helena Hayes, and I am Mr. Sterling's attorney. Any future communication will go through me. We are aware of the situation and will act in accordance with the law to ensure the well-being of the minor. Goodbye." She hung up. She turned to Arthur, her face grim. "He knows who you are. He saw the car. Maybe he ran the plates. He doesn't want his daughter, Arthur. He wants your money. His indifference has turned into calculated greed. He's going to use the law as a weapon. This is the first major twist, and it's exactly what I feared." Helena's calm was almost more frightening than Rick's threat. "What do we do now?" Arthur asked, feeling the ground shift beneath him. "Now we play his game, but we play it better. We're going to contact CPS ourselves. We'll report the neglect, the abandonment, the extortion attempt. We're going to get ahead of him. But be prepared, Arthur. Once the system gets involved, things will get ugly. He'll paint you as the villain, a rich man using his power to steal the child of a poor, struggling father. And the system, all too often, tends to believe the simplest narrative." At that moment, the guest room door opened slowly, and Leah appeared, rubbing her sleepy eyes, completely oblivious to the web being woven around her. She looked at Arthur with a small, shy smile, a ray of sunshine in the gathering storm, and he knew he would fight no matter how ugly the battle became. Following Helena's advice, Arthur spent the next few days in a state of controlled anxiety. They filed a formal report with Child Protective Services, detailing the abandonment on the highway, the squalid conditions of the home, and the clear extortion attempt by Rick. Helena was meticulous, Gathering as much evidence as possible, including the recording of the phone call, Arthur expected swift action, an intervention that would validate his decision. Instead, he hit a wall of bureaucracy. These things take time. We have to follow protocol. An investigation will be opened. The answers were always vague and impersonal. In the meantime, he devoted himself to creating a routine for Leah. He bought her new clothes, toys, and coloring books. He discovered she loved pancakes with chocolate syrup and had a surprising talent for assembling complex jigsaw puzzles. In just a few days, Arthur's silent mansion came to life. Laughter echoed in the halls, and colorful drawings adorned the door of the brushed steel refrigerator. He found himself completely captivated by this little creature, feeling a kind of protective affection he never imagined he was capable of. The calm, however, was the quiet before the storm. On a Friday morning, exactly 1 week after their meeting on the road, the doorbell rang. It was Rick, but he wasn't alone. Flanking him were 2 uniformed police officers. Leah's father had made good on his threat. He looked different. He was showered, wearing clean, though worn, clothes. His face was a mask of perfectly rehearsed concern and anguish. "Mr. Sterling," one of the officers asked, his tone formal and suspicious. "We've received a report from Mr. Rick Dawson that his daughter, Leah Dawson, was taken without his permission and is being held at this residence." Arthur felt his blood run cold. "That's absurd. I found her abandoned. He told me I could have her." Arthur protested, his voice rising. Rick shook his head, a martyred look on his face. "I was going through a hard time, sir. I'd had a little too much to drink to drown my sorrows, but I would never abandon my daughter. I love her more than anything. This wealthy man took advantage of my weakness." The narrative was so perversely twisted that it took Arthur's breath away. The savior had become the villain, the negligent father, the victim. The officers, doing their duty, asked to come inside to check on the child's welfare. Leah, hearing the voices, appeared at the top of the stairs. When she saw her father with the police, her face contorted into a mask of terror. She ran and hid behind Arthur's legs, clinging to him tightly. "Don't let him take me, mister, please," she whispered, trembling. The scene, which to Arthur was the ultimate proof of everything, was interpreted differently by the officers. They saw a frightened child, yes, but also a rich and powerful man who, in 1 week, seemed to have created an emotional dependency in her. Rick's manipulation was brilliant in its cruelty. He wasn't just using the law, he was using child psychology itself as a weapon. His report, filed first, put Arthur on the defensive, forcing him to prove his innocence rather than Rick having to prove his competence as a father. Helena had predicted it, but the reality was so much worse. The complete inversion of the narrative was the unexpected turning point. Arthur was no longer just a good Samaritan in a complex situation. He was, in the eyes of the law, a suspect in a potential kidnapping case. The ground he thought was solid had just opened up, revealing an abyss. He was trapped, and the girl he had sworn to protect was now the centerpiece in a dangerous game he didn't know how to win. The presence of the police officers in Arthur's lavish living room created a surreal atmosphere. The blue uniforms and heavy boots seemed out of place amidst the Persian rugs and contemporary art. Leah remained attached to his leg, a frightened little koala, refusing to even look at her father. The older officer, a middle-aged man with a weary look, knelt down to try and speak with her, but the girl only hid her face more fiercely. The situation was a stalemate. Legally, they had to listen to the father. Emotionally, the child's reaction told a completely different story. After a long, tense conversation, mediated by Helena's hurried arrival, a temporary solution was reached. Leah would be taken by CPS, who had been activated by the police report, and placed in a temporary shelter until a full case evaluation could be conducted. Not with her father, not with Arthur. To the system, it was the neutral solution. To Arthur, it was a crushing defeat. To Leah, It was the materialization of her worst nightmare. The moment of her departure was one of the hardest of Arthur's life. A social worker, a stern-looking woman with an unreadable gaze, tried to take Leah's hand, but she thrashed and screamed Arthur's name. The sound of that desperate "Mister" echoed through the house, tearing his heart apart. He knelt in front of her, trying to maintain his composure. "Leah, listen to me. You're going to a safe place for a little while. I promise I will come and get you." "I promise," he said, his voice choked with emotion, holding her small face in his hands. He saw the exact moment the hope in her eyes shattered, replaced by the same resignation he had seen on the first day. She believed he was just one more empty promise in her short life. She stopped fighting and let herself be led away without looking back. Arthur stood frozen in the entryway, watching the official car drive away, feeling an emptiness so profound it left him breathless. Rick, for his part, shot him a look of disguised triumph before leaving with the police. In the days that followed, the mansion returned to its silence. But now the silence was oppressive, haunted by the absence of a child's laughter. Arthur and Helena dove into a frantic bureaucratic battle. They tried to get permission to visit her, but requests were denied on the grounds that his presence could unduly influence the child's testimony. Rick's narrative, that of the loving father victimized by a millionaire, was gaining traction. The social worker assigned to the case, a Ms. Caldwell, seemed particularly skeptical of Arthur. In a curt phone call, she implied that Leah's refusal to return to her father could be a case of accelerated parental alienation. "It's very common, Mr. Sterling. Children are impressionable. Gifts, a luxurious environment. It's easy to confuse them," she said, with a superiority that made Arthur's blood boil. The system, which he had hoped would see the truth, was becoming his greatest adversary. His good intentions were being viewed as manipulation. His wealth, instead of a resource to help, had become a weapon used against him, painting him as someone who believed he could buy a child. Arthur's frustration grew with each passing day. He felt powerless, tied up in bureaucratic red tape, while a terrified little girl was trapped in a shelter, reliving her worst fears. He spent his nights sleepless, pacing his empty house, haunted by Leah's face and the sound of her cries. The battle was no longer just for Leah. It was against a blind system and a man who had turned fatherhood into a tool for extortion. The emotional bond he had built with the girl, something that had surprised him with its intensity, was now his greatest vulnerability and at the same time his only source of strength to keep fighting. Helena's strategy grew more aggressive. "If they won't let us see the truth, we'll have to dig it up," she said during a late-night meeting in Arthur's study. The mahogany desk was covered in documents, reports, and notes. Arthur's frustration was palpable, a nervous energy that kept him from sitting still. "We can no longer depend on the system's goodwill. We need irrefutable proof that dismantles Rick's charade." Helena hired a private investigator, a discreet and efficient ex-cop named Marcus Shaw. His task was simple: find out everything about Rick Dawson's life, every debt, every lost job, every neighbor who might have witnessed something. Marcus was a ghost, moving through the shadows of the neighborhood where Leah lived, talking to bartenders, shopkeepers, and neighbors who had previously preferred not to get involved. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, and the picture that emerged was even darker than Arthur had imagined. While the investigation ran in parallel, Arthur used his resources in another way. He couldn't see Leah, but he could ensure the shelter she was in was the best it could be. He made a substantial anonymous donation to the institution, contingent on immediate upgrades to the facility, the hiring of more staff, and the purchase of educational materials. He couldn't give her his personal comfort, but he could, from a distance, try to make her environment less hostile. It was a way to soothe his own helplessness, a gesture that no one but he and Helena knew the origin of. Ms. Caldwell the social worker, noted the sudden improvements at the shelter with surprise, but never made the connection. To her, Arthur Sterling was still the prime suspect for psychological manipulation. The big break in Marcus's investigation came from an unexpected source, an elderly neighbor and Mrs. Iris Gable, who had initially refused to speak for fear of Rick, finally decided to open up. She told Marcus she saw Leah frequently, a sad little girl who would spend hours sitting on the front step, waiting for her father to return. But the crucial revelation was something else. It wasn't the first time he's done this, you know, she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. About 6 months ago, the girl went missing for a whole day. He didn't seem to care. The next day, he shows up with a bunch of groceries, good food, even a new TV, said he'd come into some extra cash. The information was a bombshell. Marcus, with his detective's patience, kept digging. He found out that, around that time, a tourist couple's car had broken down near the town. They had found a crying little girl on the side of a secondary road. Taking pity on her, they brought her to the local police station. Rick showed up, crying, saying she had gotten lost. The couple, feeling both guilty and relieved, gave him a considerable amount of cash to help out. The truth was a punch to Arthur's gut. This wasn't neglect fueled by alcoholism. It was a scheme, a cruel, calculated pattern. Rick didn't just abandon his daughter. He used her as bait. He counted on the compassion of strangers to then extort money from them, either through guilt or intimidation. Leah was the unwitting centerpiece of a monstrous plan. The discovery changed everything. The case was no longer about a flawed father versus a wealthy benefactor. It was about systematic abuse and exploitation. Armed with this new ammunition, Helena requested an emergency hearing, presenting the new evidence. However, the bureaucracy, like a slow, lumbering beast, did not move with the urgency they hoped for. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, 2 weeks in which Leah would remain in limbo, and Rick, aware he was being investigated, could become even more dangerous and unpredictable. The trap was closing, not on Rick, but on the little girl herself, caught between her father's greed and the slow grind of justice. The 2-week wait was torture for Arthur. The revelation of Rick's scheme filled him with a cold rage and a desperate urgency. Every day Leah spent away from him, trapped in the system, was a victory for her abusive father. During this time, communication with the shelter was strictly formal and handled by Helena. The reports they received were clinical and detached, mentioning that Leah was adjusting but exhibiting withdrawn behavior and episodes of nighttime crying. Each word was a knife in Arthur's chest. He imagined the confusion and fear in her eyes, the feeling of being abandoned yet again, this time by the person who had promised her safety. Guilt gnawed at him. Even though he knew he was doing everything in his power, the mansion, once his refuge, now felt like a gilded cage of impotence. Helena, meanwhile, worked tirelessly, preparing for the hearing. She gathered the sworn statement from Mrs. Gable, the police records from the incident with the tourist couple, and a detailed financial report showing inexplicable spending spikes from Rick immediately following Leah's supposed disappearances. The strategy was clear: expose the pattern of exploitation. However, she warned him of the difficulty. "We're dealing with the word of an elderly neighbor and circumstantial evidence against a father's parental rights. Arthur, a good lawyer could argue it's all coincidence, that Rick is just an unlucky, single dad struggling to get by." The uncertainty hung over them like a storm cloud. The greatest twist, however, came from the least expected person. During one of her evaluation sessions with a new psychologist at the shelter, a younger, more empathetic professional who had replaced the previous one, Leah, who had barely spoken until then, finally began to open up. The psychologist, Dr. Evans, used a doll therapy technique. She gave Leah a family of dolls, a father, a mother, a little girl. Leah, in silence, picked up the father doll and the girl doll. She put them in a toy car and pushed them far away. Then she took the girl doll out of the car and left it alone in a corner of the room. "Daddy said it was a game," Leah whispered, the first full sentence she had spoken in days. Dr. Evans, sensing she was on the verge of something important, just listened. "He taught me how to cry really loud. He said if I cried, nice people would come help me, and then Daddy would come get me, and we'd have money to buy ice cream." Her voice was flat, as if reciting a learned lesson. "But this time, I didn't want to play anymore. The man in the car, he gave me a warm blanket and mac and cheese, and his bed was fluffy. I didn't want Daddy to come get me. I wanted to stay with the mister." The confession, made with the innocence of a child who doesn't fully grasp the monstrosity of her own words, was devastating. It wasn't just neglect or abandonment for extortion. It was deep, calculated psychological abuse. Rick hadn't just used her as bait. He had trained her to be bait. He had corrupted the very essence of her childhood, turning her tears into a performance. Dr. Evans, shocked, documented every word. Her report, added to the case file the day before the hearing, was the missing piece. It was the voice of the victim herself, finally heard, and her revelation had the power to change the course of everything. The truth, from the purest source, was about to blow up in everyone's face. The hearing room was a cold, impersonal space with beige walls and dark wood furniture that seemed to soak up all light and hope. Arthur felt like an outsider there, his expensive suit clashing with the atmosphere of quiet despair that filled the place. He sat next to Helena, whose straight shoulders and focused expression were his only source of stability. Across the room, Rick sat with a sleazy-looking attorney, a man with a smug grin. Rick, once again, was playing the part of the wronged father. His face twisted into a mask of concern. The air was thick with tension, each second dragging on like an hour. The judge, a woman with graying hair and a sharp, perceptive gaze, entered, and the silence became absolute. Leah's fate would be decided in this room. The hearing began with Rick's attorney, who painted a pathetic picture of a single father struggling with poverty, whose only mistake was succumbing to drink in a moment of despair. He portrayed Arthur as a wealthy predator who took advantage of the situation to try and buy a child, influencing her with luxury and promises. Every word was a venomous distortion of the truth, and it took all of Arthur's self-control not to stand up and scream. When it was Helena's turn, the atmosphere began to shift. She presented the evidence methodically, Mrs. Gable's testimony, the police records of the prior incident, the financial analysis. The judge's expression grew more serious, and the smug smile on Rick's attorney's face faltered. But the masterstroke was the introduction of Dr. Evans' report. Helena asked for permission to read excerpts aloud. As Leah's words about her father's game echoed through the courtroom, a chill ran down everyone's spine. The description of being trained to cry, the promise of ice cream as a reward, the confession that she didn't want to play anymore. The cruelty of the scheme was laid bare in its purest, most devastating form. Rick turned pale, his loving father act crumbling under the weight of his own daughter's confession. He started to mutter denials, but his voice lacked conviction. The judge looked at him, no longer with doubt but with cold contempt. The climax, however, was yet to come. The judge, following protocol for highly complex cases, called for a closed chambers meeting with just herself, Leah, and the psychologist. The goal was to hear from the child directly, without the pressure of the involved adults. Arthur and Rick were left outside in a silent hallway, separated by a chasm of hatred and fear. For Arthur, those were the longest minutes of his life. He pictured Leah, so small, sitting in an intimidating room, having to verbalize her fears and desires. The pressure on her was immense. What if her father's training was stronger? What if her fear of him made her lie, say she wanted to go home? The possibility was terrifying. When the door opened again, the judge emerged with an unreadable expression. She looked at neither Arthur nor Rick. She simply announced that her decision would be delivered in open court in 10 minutes. At that moment, Rick's attorney approached Arthur and Helena, the smug grin replaced by a calculating stare. "My client is willing to relinquish custody," he said in a low voice, "in exchange for fair compensation for his trauma. Let's say $250,000. Otherwise, when he gets custody back, he's going to disappear with the girl, and you will never see her again." The blackmail was explicit, a final desperate act of greed. The threat to disappear with Leah, even in the face of all the evidence, showed Arthur that Rick was a man with nothing to lose. The legal battle seemed won, but the war for Leah's safety had just reached its most dangerous and unpredictable point. The courthouse hallway seemed to shrink around Arthur. The proposal from Rick's attorney wasn't a settlement, it was a knife to his throat. The threat to disappear with Leah was the final move of a cornered man, an act of cruelty that proved, beyond any doubt, his utter unfitness as a father. Helena, at Arthur's side, remained as cold as ice. "Your offer is noted, Counselor, and it will be duly reported to the judge as further evidence of extortion and coercion," she replied, her voice sharp. The lawyer just shrugged, as if to say, "I tried," and walked away. Arthur's mind was racing. $250,000. The money was meaningless to him, a grain of sand in his fortune. He could pay it and end this, ensure Rick vanished from their lives forever. But was it the right thing to do, to pay a monster to give up his own daughter? That wasn't justice. It was a sordid transaction that would validate Rick's methods. And what guarantee did he have that Rick wouldn't come back years later, demanding more? Before he could ponder the moral dilemma, the courtroom door opened again. They were called back in. The tension was almost unbearable. Arthur could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. He didn't dare look at Rick, but he could feel the man's venomous stare on his back. The judge sat, adjusted her glasses, and looked at the papers before her. Leah was not present. A day after reviewing all the evidence presented, the judge began, her voice resonating with authority, "Including the psychological report and the conversation I had with the minor, Leah Dawson, this court has reached a decision." Arthur held his breath. Every fiber of his being was focused on those words. It has become clear to this court that there is a pattern of chronic neglect, psychological abuse, and financial exploitation on the part of the father, Mr. Rick Dawson. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through Arthur's side of the room. "Therefore, Mr. Rick Dawson's parental rights are permanently terminated," the judge continued. The sound was like an explosion of silence. Rick shot to his feet. "This is outrageous! She's my daughter! You can't do this!" he yelled, his face red with fury. The judge banged her gavel. "Order in the court! Mr. Dawson, any further outburst and you will be held in contempt. Furthermore, a criminal investigation will be opened based on the evidence of extortion and child exploitation." Rick sank into his chair, defeated, his face a mask of impotent rage. Arthur felt a wave of triumph, but it was fleeting. The main question still hung in the air. What would happen to Leah? The judge turned to him. "Mr. Sterling, your initial action, while well-intentioned, was irregular. However, your subsequent actions and your clear concern for the child's well-being have been noted. The minor has unequivocally expressed her desire to remain in your care." Arthur's heart leapt. Leah will be placed under the temporary custody of the state, but will reside in a foster placement. And the designated foster placement, given the exceptional circumstances and the established emotional bond, will be your residence, Mr. Sterling, under the weekly supervision of Child Protective Services. The The words took a second to sink in. He hadn't just won. He had won in a way he had never dared to hope for. He was getting Leah back. He could give her a home. You may begin the formal adoption process immediately, should you so choose, the judge concluded. Tears welled up in Arthur's eyes, tears of relief and of a joy so overwhelming it left him trembling. He looked at Helena, who gave him a small, genuine smile. The battle was won. The system, which for so long had seemed like an enemy, had finally delivered justice. In that moment of maximum tension, the resolution was not just legal, but profoundly emotional. The family he never had was, miraculously, beginning to form. The drive home was completely different from the first time. There was no tense uncertainty, only the radiant calm of a new beginning. Leah, sitting in the passenger seat, was no longer curled into a ball. She gazed out the window with renewed curiosity, as if seeing the world for the first time. Every so often, she would look over at Arthur and smile, a small, shy smile that lit up her whole face. And Arthur would smile back, feeling a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he finally recognized as pure, simple happiness. The mansion, once a symbol of his loneliness, now welcomed them as a true home. As they walked in, Leah ran to the living room and hugged one of the large sofa cushions. "I missed how it smells in here," she said, her voice muffled by the fabric. "It smells like home." Those words, spoken so simply, were the greatest gift Arthur could have received. The following weeks were a period of adjustment and healing, under the discreet but present supervision of Ms. Caldwell, who, after the hearing, had begun to treat him with newfound respect. Arthur and Leah started to build their new life. He enrolled her in a small private school where, after an initial adjustment period, she began making friends. He helped her with her homework, read her bedtime stories, and taught her how to ride a bike in the expansive garden. Every moment was a discovery. Arthur, the ruthless tycoon in the business world, found he was surprisingly good at braiding hair after watching several online tutorials and packing the perfect lunch with the bread cut into star shapes. He learned that Leah was afraid of the dark, but that a small galaxy nightlight solved the problem. He learned that her laughter was the best sound in the world. Leah, in turn, blossomed with each passing day. The shadows in her eyes gave way to a bright spark of confidence. She stopped startling at loud noises and began to express her own opinions and desires. The silent, frightened girl from the side of the road was transforming into a vibrant, lively child. The adoption process, initiated by Helena, proceeded without a hitch. It was just a matter of time and paperwork. Rick Dawson, after the hearing, had vanished. An investigation revealed he had left town, likely to flee the legal consequences of his actions. For Arthur, it was a relief. He felt no hatred, only a deep pity for a man so broken he had been unable to love the most precious thing in his life. One of the most touching moments on this journey of healing happened on a Saturday afternoon. Arthur found Leah in her room, sitting on the floor with the old, one-eyed teddy bear. She was holding it with a thoughtful expression. "Arthur," she called out, "I don't think he needs me anymore." He sat down beside her. "What do you mean?" "Sweetie, he was my friend when I was sad, but I'm not sad anymore. I think another boy or girl who is sad needs him now." The maturity and empathy in her words left him breathless. The next day, they took the teddy bear to a donation center. Leaving that symbol of her painful past behind was a final act of liberation for Leah. She was ready to embrace her future. And Arthur, the man who had always felt left behind, had finally found his place in the world, not in his possessions, but in the heart of a little girl he had saved, and who, in every way that mattered, had also saved him. The main conflicts were resolved, and the narrative arcs were moving toward a conclusion of peace and fulfillment. 6 months after that rainy day on the highway, Arthur Sterling's life was unrecognizable in the most wonderful way. The final adoption decree arrived on a sunny spring morning, an official document that sealed on paper what their hearts already knew. They were a family, Leah Sterling. The name sounded perfect. To celebrate, they did something simple but deeply symbolic. They decided to take a road trip, and the destination was Leah's choice. She wanted to go back to that same highway. Arthur hesitated for a moment, fearing the place might bring back painful memories, but she insisted with a wisdom that was beyond her 7 years. "It's just a place, Dad. What matters is who we are now." The word "dad," which he had started using naturally a few weeks prior, still made Arthur's heart skip a beat with emotion. They drove down the same deserted highway. The sun was shining, painting the landscape in vibrant colors, a stark contrast to the grey palette of their first meeting. The luxury car was the same, but the atmosphere inside was one of pure joy and companionship. They sang along with the radio, told jokes, and planned their trip. As they passed the exact spot where he had found her, Arthur slowed down. He glanced at the shoulder, now covered in small wildflowers. Leah squeezed his hand. "Thank you for stopping, Dad," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I thank you, sweetie, every single day," he replied, his throat tight with emotion. The road that once symbolized abandonment and despair had been transformed into a landmark of hope and second chances. The legal battle, however, had left an indelible mark on Arthur. He saw firsthand how the system, despite its good intentions, could be flawed and blind to the nuances of abuse. He couldn't just go back to his old life, ignoring the other Leahs that might be out there. Using his resources and Helena's expertise, he established the Fresh Start Foundation, an organization dedicated to identifying and combating child exploitation schemes, offering legal and psychological support to vulnerable children. The foundation developed an innovative program where rescued children like Leah could, in a therapeutic and play-based way, help professionals identify signs of manipulation and abuse that adults often missed. The final scene of their journey unfolds a year later. Arthur and Leah are visiting one of the foundation's partner shelters. Leah, now a confident and articulate girl, sits with a group of children, showing them how the sad games some adults teach them to play are not their fault. She speaks with an empathy and strength that moves every adult in the room. Arthur watches her from a distance, his heart overflowing with pride and love. He had learned that true wealth wasn't in his bank statements, but in the courage to fight for what's right, even when the whole world seems to be against you. Leah had learned that family isn't defined by blood ties, but by unconditional love, protection, and respect. As they leave the shelter, hand in hand, they walk under a late afternoon sky. Their journey had been arduous, filled with pain and uncertainty, but it had led them to a place of purpose and redemption. The most unlikely of meetings on a lonely road had brought them together, not just to form a family, but to create a wave of change that would touch countless other lives. The highway that had witnessed a cruel abandonment now echoed with stories of hope, proving that when compassion meets determination, even the deepest wounds can be transformed into a triumph of love over darkness.